the evening, the wonderful David Bramwell.
Come on, David.
This is kind of Christmassy. There is a kind of Christmas element to this, in that I hope that at the end of this talk I might have encouraged a few of you to rush home and go to Amazon, eBay, 8 Books, whatever, to get some last-minute Christmas presents, which we know won't arrive in time, owing to the myriad strikes taking place across the country. But I'm hoping that you will be inspired. Some of you will be inspired by my talk in celebration of B. Kliban. And this talk begins a few years ago when I was staying at a friend's place in London and happened to stumble upon the Cartoon Museum. I didn't know this existed in London. And I went in, and there's a great library of cartoon books, past and present. And there was lots of books in the shop as well. Lots of books. So excitedly I went to the guy who was working there and I said, "Do you have a copy of The Biggest Tongue in Tunisia?" And he gave me a blank look. And I said, it's by B. Kliban. And he gave me a blank look. And I said, the cat guy, the guy who did the cats. And he said, oh, there's the book, by the way, there's The Biggest Tongue in Tunisia. He said, oh, if you want cats, we've got lots of Garfield. And in that moment, the seed of this talk began. Because Kliban is, I think, a forgotten genius of the cartooning world, and I want to celebrate and share his work with you. Now, he did all right in his lifetime, Kliban. He probably became a millionaire because of his cat cartoons. And it was this book, and I've got copies of some of his work over here that you can look at afterwards. And Cat came out in 1976 and was an enormous success. And the merchandise that has followed was probably as instrumental in his fortunes, and still sells today. So his cat artwork, his cat merchandise like mugs, cat calendars. I googled this yesterday, and sure enough, 2023, there's a Kliban cat calendar, and it'll be very popular. And his cat, you know, we love cats. Cats are probably the most Googled thing, aren't they? And his cats were not overly sentimental. They were not overly cutesy. He was quite surreal and playful as an artist, as a cartoonist. So this is a kind of a typical Kliban cartoon from his cat book, which shows, you know, a kind of surrealist sense of humour. Whacker, not widely used. And now, I've got a cat. Her name is Fez, and she looks a bit like Kliban's cat, and she might say trout sometimes. But this talk is not about cats. It's not about his cats, despite I Am Cute Kitten receiving 50 million downloads. So what I want to talk to you about is his other body of work. So that's what he's best remembered for. But then even somebody working at the Cartoon Museum doesn't know the name Kliban, which I think is shocking. So want to bring his name and his work kind of back into the public consciousness. So to do that, we need to go back to the 1980s and the place that I grew up, which was Doncaster. Okay, so here's a photo. It could be Doncaster. And Donny was not an easy place to grow up in the 80s. There was the miners' strike. There was a lot of poverty. It's quite a violent town to grow up in, and it was a town with a population bigger than Brighton, but a town without a bookshop. Not a single bookshop when I was growing up. There were no books to be found other than in the library or the school that I went to. I got quite into heavy metal. You had two choices as a teenager: heavy metal or new romantic. The girls tended to get into new romantics, and the boys got into heavy metal. It was very strict binary culture back then. So I kind of cut quite a mean figure. That's me on the right. Cut quite a mean figure in my AC/DC t-shirt. But you know, maybe surprisingly, I was actually quite nerdy as a teenager. And like me and Paul, who's my friend, in his AC/DC t-shirt, also looking quite menacing. We'd sit around in our bedrooms and recite Monty Python sketches and the usual kind of cliche things you did back then. And for shits and giggles, we would go to Wakefield, which is a smaller, less significant town than Doncaster, for a day trip. But the reason we did that was because Wakefield, which looked a bit like that, Wakefield had a bookshop, which was one more than Donny. Until 2008, Doncaster got its first bookshop in 2008 when somebody built a university on a roundabout in the city, because it's now a city, and they thought we should get a bookshop for students. And so we were in this bookshop, and we pick up this book. It was just exciting, touching, and feeling books, but we picked up this book called Two Guys Fooling Around with the Moon, and we liked Gilliam's kind of cartoons and humour in the Pythons and other things. So we picked it up and we opened it up, and that's the first image. So that's the first picture that Kliban chose to put in this collection, this kind of random collection of cartoons. Fiddick had no idea back then what that meant, and still had no idea now. So we turned the page, and the next page, flimsy dog model, and we rather liked the kind of the smug expression of father and son, and that made us smile. So we carried on. Continuous eye person was kind of weird, a bit disturbing, but we liked that. That was just daft, and that tickled us. And then we sort of struck gold, because the idea of somebody giving a pair of driving gloves to a goldfish for its birthday was classic. It was classic kind of teenage Python-esque humour, and a purchase was made. And so we sat on the bus home to Donny, and we just poured over Two Guys Fooling Around with the Moon, and just fell in love with this collection, this collection of what seemed to be quite random ideas, but some thought-provoking, some bizarre, some utterly mystifying, and some in which the joke didn't land until many, many years later. Now, I didn't know who Freud was at the age of 15. So this only made sense years later. And in fact, I mean, maybe like all good art, it takes a while for it to, kind of fully present itself to you. This one only landed about 4 years ago. I'm always mystified by this, downstairs at the Mormon Tabernacle. What does it mean? And then a few years ago, I can't remember how, I stumbled across a photo of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. That's the Mormon Tabernacle. And then decades later, that's a great cartoon. And the idea that they'd just be using a broom to bang on the ceiling. So for Paul and I, this book became a little Bible for the two of us. It was a secret that we had, that nobody else had. And some of the cartoons and the words from the cartoons became catchphrases that we would use in a kind of, boyish, secretive way, like, I go for a man in a thick suit, hey mister, you drop your DNA. Not that big. I wish I had a girl. And then this one where we actually persuaded our maths class to do this whenever Mr. Andrews, the maths teacher, wherever his back was turned and he was drawing on the board, and we'd shout "now," and then everyone would get up and just a bit like Eric Morecambe's kind of thing. We'd all do that and then try and sit down again without being spotted. Usually we were spotted. And so that was a real delight, discovering this collection. But it wasn't until I reached the age of 18, went through clearing after getting almost no points in my A-levels, but just enough to go to Coventry, because Coventry Poly was just desperate they'd take anybody, as long as you took whatever degree they offered you. So I just had to take, I didn't have any choice, in my place or degree. But I was keen to get out of Doncaster and see the world and go somewhere. I'd heard that Coventry was a city and that, there was exciting places, and I went to Coventry expecting this, and I got that. The only thing that Coventry had back in the 80s was that the Specials had got, was it number one, wasn't it? Number one with a song called Ghost Town, which was basically a warning saying to people, do not come to this town. It's a dangerous, violent, depressing town. You'd be better off somewhere like Doncaster or Wakefield, or Scunthorpe, where I was actually born. So I landed in Coventry, and I kind of shook off my heavy metal roots and got into indie, as you do when you get to college. And my hero became Ian McCulloch from Echo and the Bunnymen. It's like, I want to be like Ian McCulloch. I want to have that hair. How does he do that? That's just brilliant. So I had to go with the hair, and yeah. But but it was in the second-hand bookshop on Walsgrave Road in Coventry. Coventry had bookshops. Oh my God! It was so exciting to find all these treasures, and it was where I started to pick up other old copies of Kliban's work from the 70s. Tiny Footprints is a joy to behold. This is a collection with no text whatsoever. So you've got these beautiful, I'm sorry this is a little bit pixelated on such a great screen to have, but I should get better quality. But these lovely kind of surreal images. That was my childhood really, you know, kind of in a nutshell. And after this I discovered Never Eat Anything Bigger Than Your Head and Whack Your Porcupine. Now, as a teenager, having discovered Kliban with Paul, what we were initially drawn to, or immediately drawn to, was the humour and the wackiness and the silliness. But as time passed, I started to really appreciate the style and the skill of Kliban as an illustrator, as a cartoonist, and also the subtleties as well. So in chapter 11, Lucille is secretly thrilled when Norman sucks her toaster. It's a stupid cartoon, but actually the expressions on their faces are just wonderful, and how ungainly Norman's body is and his posture. Like I really got to enjoy these little details in his work. Or this one, the callous sophisticates laughed at Judy's tiny head. All of their expressions are beautiful, aren't they? You know, kind of the disdain, the sardonic looks in their faces. And if we take an image like this one, Roger Wilco, again, sorry, a little bit pixelated. You can see there's a Robert Crumb influence. So this is not an illustrator or cartoon. It's just sticking to one style, but playing with different styles, inspired. And there is no punchline to this. This is a portrayal of a young man, and middle America sort of crops up again and again, portrayals of people from middle America, like the wagon of love breaks under the baggage of life, and you get the feeling that there's kind of a mix of sardonic humour and tenderness for the people that he is drawing, either from real life or from imagination, and I think there's again the sort of the subtlety and the humanity in this as well. So, as you do when you get to Polytechnic or university, you join a band. I created a band, and we needed a name. And I thought, well, I know where I'd go for inspiration. I'd go to Kliban. A visit to the Spoon Museum, which has always tickled me, Spoon Museum became the name of a band that I played in for 3 years at Coventry. And I decided that I was kind of sick of living in these kind of down at heel industrial towns in the north, and so set my vision on Brighton, or is that Eastbourne? I'm never quite sure. Actually, the beach is quite clean. It's probably Eastbourne. But so I came to Brighton. I had this idea that Brighton was going to be this wonderful utopian place, and it was sort of a mix of, it was a bit like kind of Eastbourne meets Coventry in terms of its presentation, but it was two-way books on Garden Street. I mean, Brighton would just in the early 90s had dozens of bookshops and loads of second-hand bookshops. Two-way books where I found Luminous Animals, which is a different format. It's a larger size collection with some coloured plates as well in it, and it includes just wonderful collection, which includes the completing the Transcontinental Enema, a particular favourite of mine. So I continued with music in Brighton, formed a band. We needed a name. What should we call ourselves? No, we didn't call ourselves the Transcontinental Animals. We called ourselves Luminous, taken from Luminous Animals. And we weren't the only people to do that. So Tim and Sue, see the All Meat Puppets, was the inspiration for the Meat Puppets, who were a sort of grungy sub-pop band from the late 80s, early 90s. And can anyone guess which of those inspired a band name? Sadly, yes, Pornflakes were a mediocre rock band from the 90s and noughties. And I gradually collected most of Kliban's books, apart from The Biggest Tongue in Tunisia. This one eluded me. This was the rarity. Every bookshop I go into, every jumble sale, every car boot, looking for this book, asking people. Nobody had a copy. And it was this man, the one on the right, not Paul McCartney. It was Ivor Cutler, who I don't know why I did this, and I can't remember what the process was that led to me writing to him. But Ivor Cutler was a humorist, a harmonium player, poet, eccentric, one of a kind. And I wrote to him. I must have heard or read somewhere that he would help people find books that they were in search of. So I wrote to him asking if he knew where I might find a copy, and he suggested this bookshop in London. But I never went. That was 1995. I never went. I don't know why. London was a long way away from Brighton. But I didn't go. So the book continued to elude me over the decades. Now, it wasn't until 1990, when Kliban died, that I actually found out anything about the man. Not least his first name, which was a closely guarded secret. He didn't want anyone to know his name. So apologies to the departed spirit of Bernard Kliban. His name was Bernard, but his people called him Hap. That was the name that he liked to go by. And he was a San Franciscan art school dropout who really valued his privacy. And in written interviews, he would describe himself as a 6'3" blonde Swedish man, so that people wouldn't, have the chance of recognising him. And he was, by all accounts, very kind with up-and-coming cartoonists and artists, and would help them in any way they could. And these are really lovely that he's written to people. And he said that his most cherished moment was receiving a letter from Michael Palin from the Pythons, saying what a big fan he was of his work, and he said that meant more than anything else. And we've got a few pictures of him. There's very, very little on the internet. Very, very little. There's one recorded interview that he did, or the only known one that we have, which is about 6 minutes long, and he just doesn't want to talk about himself, and he doesn't want to talk about his work. He comes across as painfully shy. And there we go. Let's feel like Freddie Mercury there. Now, his career kind of started because Hugh Hefner at Playboy recognised his skill and said, "Do you want to just kind of run riot on the pages of Playboy magazine?" So that's sort of how his career started. And of course, that's a little problematic looking back on a culture from the 1970s of things like Playboy, which may make us ask the question, is he someone who is still valid today? Is his work still relevant, or is it problematic as we turn over the pages of his work, and it's it's a little bit of its time. Now, I thought let's not avoid this. I'll choose 4 pictures. There's a lot. There is without doubt an objectification of women in some of his work. There's always a degree of ambiguity around. Well, not ambiguity. There's I don't know. It's very much from a male perspective, isn't it? It's very much from a male perspective, but also a little surreal too, like the one in the bottom left-hand corner. I'd like to think that there's something progressive about a male cartoonist imagining the practical problems of a female superhero, needing to breastfeed whilst also going off to save the world. I'd like to think that comes from a good place. And pictures like this, I feel like he's kind of subverting the stereotypes of men and women back in the day, or certainly having fun with it. And thankfully, this picture gives us a very clear perspective on what his attitudes were towards race and racism. And also, I like the fact that he would depict God as a woman in this picture as well, pouring. Now, I'll give you a little bit of time to read this, because I think it's a lovely one of his. And for those of a certain age, good, I like a little pause in there. Those of us, anyone feel that this reminds them of another cartoonist? Larson. Okay, so It could easily have been a Gary Larson cartoon, this, okay? Gary Larson acknowledges Bernard Kliban as a major influence. And I think Larson's body of work is fantastic, and it's very clear in its aims. It's, you know, there's an anthropomorphism of the natural world, and that's kind of pretty much the track that he's run along for decades. And so, you know, here's a classic Larson Roberta takes on a dust rhino. But what I love about Kliban is that Kliban's work is so much broader that you cannot predict when you turn from one page to another in any Kliban collection. You cannot predict what's going to come next, not the theme or the style. It really is extraordinary that his mind was so, it danced and bounced around so much. Who knows, you know, where all of these ideas could possibly come from. Now, he had a real disdain for traditional forms of cartooning. He hated the speech bubble, the caption, and refused to use them. The only time they really feature in his work is if he is parodying the form, like in this one here. Kliban was much more of sort of pioneering this style of cartooning. Cynthia is mistakenly crowned King of Norway. And there's something deadpan and surreal about this, which we're very familiar with and very comfortable with, this kind of humour now. And we do find this kind of thing on greeting cards. But back in the 70s, this was quite a radical and different way of approaching cartooning. I was in a museum in Paris a couple of years ago and came across this image, and I was looking at it thinking, this reminds me of something. And I kind of went back home and looked through my Kliban collections, and Genitals of the Universe, Part 4. I was thinking, yeah, there's kind of something of the, you know, there's something of the softness and the weirdness and the squidginess of this. Does anyone know who this was by? That chap. So there's, you know, I'm not saying there's a Picasso influence in, but it kind of shows the diversity of style. These 4 images, very heavily inked, very dark, and I think deliberately undecipherable, the text, remind me of Edmund Gorey, which many of you will know. So, you know, so as I say, there's a real diversity of style going on within his body of work. What have we got next? So, Kliban's cats and the ephemera around the cats still sells really well, whereas his collections, when I first gave this talk, his collections were selling for a penny on Amazon. But as we know, the aggressive algorithms of Amazon have kind of changed things over the years, so that when a book is out of print, suddenly the price rockets up. So when I first gave this talk, I would say to the audience, go home and buy these collections. They're a penny. They're amazing. They're timeless. And they make great gifts. If you don't want them, you want to give them to somebody. They're not a penny anymore. Yesterday, looking on eBay and Amazon, nearly £83 for never eat anything bigger than your head. But, which would in a way could make this talk redundant, because I want to say go away and explore his body of work. But if you dig into the various portals in which you can get second-hand books, including Amazon and eBay, you will find bargains. So Tiny Footprints I found for less than £6. Whack Your Porcupine I found for £10, and Two Guys Fiddling Around with the Moon for less than £4. So the bargains are out there. You can still get these relatively cheap. There's a beautiful box set as well, which you can only get from America, but you can buy it for about £35 and then about £20 for postage. But you get the 4 classics in there, which I heartily recommend. Grayson Perry, why are you here? Grayson is here because he gave this wonderful wreath lecture, or 3 wreath lectures, many years ago. And one of the things that he talked about was he felt that one of his struggles as a potter and as a craftsperson within the art world was that skill and craft had become dirty words, and that you know, the art world that he grew up in certainly embraced shock tactics and high concepts, perhaps over the kind of skills that we might have more traditionally associated with the art world. And I think that maybe one of the reasons why Kliban has faded into obscurity is because his style is sort of unfashionable now. Because if we look at the cartoonists and illustrators who are incredibly popular, we've got things like Modern Toss, which is deliberately done in a kind of scratchy, throwaway style or someone like David Shrigley. And I am expressing my prejudices here, but I don't like this work because I feel that it's utterly disposable. So once I've got the joke, whether you find it funny or not, once you've got the joke, there is no need to return to these at all. There's no beauty or joy or detail within, for me anyway, within these illustrations. I wouldn't want this on my wall or even on a t-shirt or a tea towel, which is where they most commonly appear. So, but apologies if I'm offending anybody who's a big fan of this work. But I feel that it's too reductionist and it's too easy to present work like this. And then I put it next to Kliban, and then I put it next to like any Kliban piece of work like The Unfortunate Child, and the sideways glance of the young girl eating the ice cream, and the implausibility of The Unfortunate Child with the ice cream stuck in his head. I love this. I can come back to this again and again and again and take great joy from it, and also, you know, not least from the skill as well. You know, the haughty face of the mother. And I love, it's like, as I say, you don't know what's coming next. And there are certain themes. Isn't this wonderful? There are certain themes that he does come back to again and again, and he loves this idea of a very unlikely abortive beginning to a story, the chapter 1, in which you know there's not going to be a chapter 2, so everybody kills each other, is a brilliant one, and nobody says anything to anybody. This is absolutely one of my favourites because of all the wonderful, bizarre detail of, you know, Monroe on his hands and knees. The fact that Carl and Carl have the same name and they're not wearing trousers and that's never going to be explained. What's going on with Melanie and the tragic vampish Sis. I love this so much that I've had a print made and hung it on my wall. And I couldn't imagine hanging a modern Toss or a David Shrigley or even a Banksy, if I'm honest, you know, on the wall and never looking at it again. It's like, you know, it would be glanced at a couple of times and then forgotten. But I get great pleasure from looking at this. I adore the work, and my cat's a little indifferent there, but so, and also what other artist, what other cartoonist whose work would still most likely just be found in the humorous section of any bookshop, which is, you know, sort of slightly damning, isn't it, to be put in that section. There's a sense of something disposable about that section of the bookshop, which screams, you know, kind of Christmas gifts that no one's going to read, and then they'll end up, you know, kind of going to a charity shop. What other cartoonist who would have their work graded in order of low difficulty to high difficulty by fans online, in which there are still images and ideas that people are confused and talking about even now? And we'll look at the low difficulty and high difficulty examples. Sensitive Persons in Area is a low difficulty illustration. He clearly has a disdain for pretentiousness in art, and it's very clearly spelt out in this one. When we go to the high difficulty, not really an idea what's going on in this picture at all. I mean, he likes wordplay, but it's, you know, it's not biting the hand that feeds you, because that's the tail. Why have they got tails, serpent tails? Nobody knows. No one knows what that. And because it's Kliban, it might not mean anything. It might just have tickled him to draw a picture with this in, without it really, you know, meaning anything at all. But as we get to the end, he can be absolutely kind of straightforward in his silliness, and sometimes in his crudeness. But bearing in mind, this is an artist whose body of work really was created in the 1970s. As we go through and we explore, and I've shown you a tiny snapshot of his work tonight, we go through and look at some of the work. I mean, this is a man who preempted reality TV, you know? And this is someone who was unequivocal about their attitude towards business, and you know, think of the film like the Human Centipede. I mean, but you know, it's a very striking image, and he parodies religion and religious belief. He parodies advertising, but in a very clever way. I think, you know, it's not straightforward. There's always a kind of fresh angle. Now, I mean, this is interesting. This makes me think of. I mean, maybe I'll be wrong about this, but I think of. You know, we have performers nowadays like say Stuart Lee, whose shows can be very, I don't know, you know, a bit sort of too sardonic and smug, and it feels like he's sort of predicting a culture which is yet to be with this one. Pretentiousness. He mocks in several of his images, which I rather like, and he's not afraid to parody himself, to be self-deprecating about his role as a cartoonist. Now, one of the reasons that I think it's such a shame that he's not remembered anymore is there are certain artists and certain creatives who do something which is of a time and a place. You know, the work, the references, very much, it's very much fixed in the 70s, it's very much fixed in the, you know, 1840s or whatever. But Kliban, only on one occasion, only on this occasion that I can find in the entire body of work, does he directly reference something from his time. He's very careful to make his you know, his comedy, his observations pretty timeless, I think. And so the Nixon Monument is a great, you know, it's a great comment on Nixon's downfall in the 1970s. But turn a few pages and you'll find dirty fat person sits on president's face, which is not so politically correct these days, but it's a very, you know, but that is a sort of, that's a more timeless kind of humour around how we feel about politics and how we feel about many of our world leaders, and which is why I think his work endures and can be quite philosophical at times with ones like this, no loitering or wasted and useful lives and left to us to decide, you know, which is the wasted and which is the useful one. And let's not forget that at times he can just be plain silly, like Turkish vibrating soup. So I did eventually get myself a copy of The Biggest Tongue in Tunisia. I did find it, and I think I picked it up for about £8 somewhere. And this is quite an old screen grab now, so I imagine that this probably sells for over £100. It was, and I'm sure still is, you know, one of his rarer collections. But I'm absolutely delighted, you know, that when I finally got a copy of this about 10 years ago, worth it alone for reading by nostril light. So, one of the reasons why I feel like an artist like Kliban should be celebrated is because it's only once in a while that these people come along who feel like they're genuinely original and that they do something to really transform the way that we relate to art or relate to ourselves or the world around us, whether it's through you know, dark humour or whether it's through, you know, great music or whatever. Someone like Spike Milligan, who, you know, changed the face of comedy, was a one of a kind, as is, you know, an artist, a creative like Bjork, or Natalie Sharp from Lone Taxidermist, who does these most extraordinary surreal and funny performances, as you get the, you know, the gist from this snapshot here. Ivor Cutler, who's already been mentioned, or an artist like Sun Ra, who can kind of change the face of jazz music. And I'd like to put Kliban up there with individuals like that, because Kliban was someone who kind of turned the world on its head and made us able to laugh at ourselves and the world around us. And also, you know, William Blake said, I'm a universe inside my head, and how rare to come across an artist who you really feel like that universe in his head just poured out into his work endlessly and tirelessly, and so creative and so different, and yet at the same time, just like the universe itself, there remain great mysteries that may never be resolved in Kliban's body of work. Thank you for listening.